Great. Okay, I have it in slideshow mode, so I may not be able to see the chat. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon now. I'm gonna say good morning. My name is Kai, and my pronouns are they, them. I am a certified breastfeeding specialist through the Lactation Education Resources, learning, I guess, school, for lack of a better word. And I am honored to be doing this a second year in a row, giving an introduction to lactation through a disability lens. We'll talk a little bit about my history and things like that and why this is relevant for me. So to start, I have some pictures of my little ones. Last year, I had twin baby girls. So left to right, there's one photo of me nursing both the babies at the same time, tandem nursing. And then there's a solo image of my firstborn, my oldest child. And then further onto the right at the top, there's another image of me just nursing my firstborn, and then beneath that, there's another image of me tandem nursing my twins. So just a little joy to start out the morning. These are some very special pictures to me that I love sharing. So a little bit about me. I am,
Kai, we're not seeing your presentation anymore.
oh no, one second. Sorry, guys. Oh, hold on. Why is it paused? Don't stop. Pause. It's telling me it's okay. Goodness grief. Sorry, guys. Okay. Resume. Okay, how's that?
We're still seeing the presentation. Oh, there it is, about me.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Technical difficulties. Okay. So, a little bit about me. I am a mother. Though my pronouns are they, them, I do identify very heavily with being a mother. And talked a little bit already about being a certified breastfeeding specialist. I also am disabled myself, multiply disabled. So, I am autistic and have other mental health disabilities. I'm also physically disabled and am an ambulatory wheelchair user, which means that I do have some ability to walk and stand short distances, things like that, but I utilize a wheelchair as much as I can because it helps me to get around physically. And also, since we last met last year, I have acquired a new disability, which is a seizure disorder. And so another use for my wheelchair is to kind of help mitigate, if I have a seizure out in public, something of that nature, having a wheelchair makes it a little bit easier for me. And I also am a service dog user. So I have a service dog named Baloo. He's a standard poodle, and he is my best friend and helps a lot with item retrieval, mobility support, and also helps to kind of mitigate some of the mental health disabilities that I have as well. And I'm an author. So I published a book called Sweet Nectar, Hopefully Everything You Want to Know About Chestfeeding, which we'll talk about further in the presentation. So what to expect? As I said, we'll talk a little bit about my personal nursing experience, the road to publishing my book, becoming a lactation consultant, embracing my disability identity. Then we'll talk a little bit about how that shows up in my work, and then calls to action. So what you can do in your work to make things more accessible to parents who are disabled. Okay, so we're going kind of linear here or chronologically. So the past, April 19th or April 2019 was when I had my firstborn. She is the reason why I became a lactation consultant. She is the reason for this book that you see here. The cover was illustrated by my sister. Very beautiful cover art of the chest of a brown person with a blue butterfly kind of on the nipple. And it says Sweet Nectar, hopefully everything you want to know about chest feeding. And then my full name, Kylia P. Kennedy. With my daughter, she had a tongue tie, and this was not something that was identified until it was kind of too late to do anything about it in terms of our chest feeding journey. We struggled a lot. She was hospitalized around 4 months for failure to thrive. And all along the way, I was kind of trying to figure out like what's wrong. Is it that I'm not making enough milk? Is it not, fatty enough, nutritious enough? What is wrong? And through this, I did so much research, ended up becoming a breastfeeding peer specialist through WIC. At the time, we were living in Baltimore. And so through Baltimore's WIC program, I was able to then get a scholarship through an organization called the Bloom Collective, which sponsored Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks in the Baltimore area to go on to get their certified breastfeeding specialist, credential or certification through lactation education resources. And as I went through this process of becoming a certified breastfeeding specialist, I learned a lot about, what struggles we went through and how they could have been avoided. And kind of this was also kind of the driving force behind, writing my book. And so in my book, I talk about, there's three different parts. So the first part, I talk about my story, from the birth of my child until we ended our journey about 11 months or so after she was born is when I stopped pumping. She stopped nursing, I think, around 6 or 7 months or so, again, because of the tongue tie. And so I go into that. I go into, what signs there were, the struggles that I had with her pediatrician, who was very anti chest feeding, anti human milk, and very pro formula. And so that was something that we struggled with as well. That was a battle. Um, and then, through that, learned more about tongue ties and things like that. And so I write about that. In the middle, the second portion, there is actually a compilation of stories from other parents who have gone through similar or, different, but just also struggles with their, human milk feeding journey. One of the stories that I always like to highlight as my favorite story is a trans mother who actually fed their baby with a supplemental nursing system on their finger, attached, taped to their finger, and their baby drank milk like that for I think about a year or so. So that's an incredible story that is included in my book as well. And then at the end, I talk about like medical aspect of things. So like how does milk supply work? What does it mean to have a perceived low supply versus an actual low supply? What is a tongue tie? What are other oral ties? What sorts of things should I be looking out for? Is pink milk safe for my baby? Things like that. And so it goes kind of in depth, and there's a glossary of terms and everything. And all of this kind of happened prior to me learning about any of my disabilities. And so we get to around April 2021, and it was, about a year into the onset of COVID-19, where, like I think a lot of people did, I downloaded TikTok and, tried to find some fun and some joy in what was, seeming to be a very, gloomy time in my life, and found a community of folks who, self-identified and then or maybe got a clinical diagnosis, but were autistic and sharing their lived experiences, sharing some of the co-occurring disabilities that can often come with being autistic, such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is the physical disability that I have. It's a connective tissue disorder, and later went on to get a clinical autism diagnosis, and that kind of started to shape, my disability advocacy. From that point, I founded a nonprofit organization where we started to give sort of, like classes and things like that, offer peer mentorship for folks who are autistic, regardless of if they have a clinical diagnosis or not. And so that was really like the start of my advocacy journey. Um, and then, for a little, further into the future. So now we're at, May 2021 through present day. So we talked about my nonprofit. I also just recently, I no longer work for, but did work for the city of Boston for their Disability Commission as their accessibility and inclusion training specialist. And so in that role, I was the sole person to provide trainings through the city about various different disability related topics, and some of which I got to kind of dabble a little bit into, the lactation world as well, and working with our Office of Women's Advancement and LGBTQIA2S plus advancement as well. And so in this, I've been able to kind of merge my two worlds and acknowledge the difficulties that can come with choosing to feed your baby human milk when you are autistic and have sensory differences, or when you're physically disabled and there's certain positions that you can't do. And I gave a TED talk that happened as well, which was very exciting. And sometimes I forget that it even happened though, because it was so long ago. But this was on my experience as an undiagnosed autistic person and moving through life in that way. So that was a lot of, context and background and history. And now we get to kind of like the good stuff that is going to help in your practice. And so in the future, so today and moving on. These are some things that I want to talk about, being identity first, language, different models of disability, and then putting that accessibility actually into practice. I will say a quick disclosure that I usually say at the beginning. There is mentions of ableist slurs in this part of the presentation, so I don't censor them for folks, so you know what it sounds like, where it comes from, but just know that they are there, and just as difficult as it might be for you to hear it, it's equally as difficult for me to say, but I think that it's important for people to understand what it is and where it came from. So. Content disclosure for that, and if you need to take a breath, have a moment, please, take care of yourself in that moment. So briefly, the models of disability. So there are kind of two main models. There's several, but there's two that most folks are familiar with. So the first model being the medical model, and this is most well known, most popular. If I can use that term. But this is what your healthcare providers, your physical therapists, occupational therapists, teachers, all that kind of world around disability, this is the model that they typically use. And this focuses kind of on independence and the individual adapting to society. It labels disability as a deficit. Oh, I gotta sneeze. Okay, I passed. Labels disability as a deficit or an abnormality or something that should be fixed, and a language that you will often hear: physical impairment, wheelchair or bedbound, low functioning, things like that. And oftentimes, this model can kind of reinforce assumptions that we make about someone's disability, or abilities rather, based on their disability. So you hear that someone is a wheelchair user, you assume that they don't have the ability to walk, but the reality is most wheelchair users actually do have some mobility, some ability to be able to walk. It is less of wheelchair users are actually like fully paralyzed from a point down. It is more common to see wheelchair users who do walk, and also encourages this model also encourages the use only of person first language, which we will talk about as we move on into the presentation. Their social model. This is kind of like the community and society adapting to the disability. So instead of expecting, somebody to have to call ahead and ask a restaurant if they have accessible seating, it's just listed on the website. Yes, we have accessible seating, that sort of thing. It says that disability is a difference. It's a normal part of the human existence. It is something that can happen to anyone at any time, and will happen to most people, even if temporarily. Most people don't think of, breaking their arm or their leg as being disabled, but that is a temporary disability that you acquire. And some are not temporary, some are lifelong and chronic, but it is regardless a normal part of the human existence. The social model also encourages language like physical disability, wheelchair user, and inserting the specific support needs. So saying that this person has bathing support needs or mobility support needs. It gives a lot more room for people with disabilities to describe their individual ability and their support needs on their terms, as opposed to making assumptions about what they might need or what might be helpful for them. An example of this is a lot of people hear, that somebody is autistic and assume that they're always going to need noise canceling headphones for, crowded or large events, things like that. But the reality is a lot of autistic people love going to concerts and don't use noise canceling headphones at all. So this is, something to kind of to like think think about when you're talking about, like letting people let you know what their needs are and what their abilities are. And the language that's used in the social model is encouraging of whatever that person is most comfortable with. So some disabled folks might be more comfortable with using person or identity first language, and some people with disabilities might be more comfortable using a person first language. Okay, so what are these terms? I said person first and identity first quite a few times. What does this mean? Well, with person first language, you're putting the person before the disability. So, for example, you're saying a person with autism, a person with hearing loss, a person with dwarfism. And this is language that can sometimes reinforce that lack of accountability on society's part. It kind of gives this idea that the disability is something that can be separated from the person. And in some cases, that is true that, somebody can be, a little person, but also be, a singer and a dancer and like, all these other things outside of their disability. And, kind of on the opposite thread of that, identity first is acknowledging that a person's disability is like a core piece of their identity, which is something that a lot of disabled folks, especially those who are in this sort of more disability activism, disability justice, movement, are more likely to use identity first language because we do feel that our disability is a core piece of our identity. So for example, you might hear people say that, I am autistic versus I have autism, or I am deaf versus I have hearing loss, or I am a little person versus I have dwarfism. And again, this is, kind of the direction that a lot of like subsections of the disability community are moving towards because it does reinforce that disability is in fact a normal part of the human existence and kind of helps people to, get comfortable with that idea and accepting disability just as it is. And, there are people who, like even for myself, say I use identity first for some of my disabilities and person first for others. So I, will usually introduce myself as an autistic person, but I have a physical disability. And that, can also change depending on the day, the person I'm talking to, how I'm feeling that day, if I'm feeling that, that my disability is a core part of who I am that day or not. You'll almost always hear me say autistic person because regardless of if it's a good day or a bad day, I'm always going to be autistic. And that is something that I cannot separate from myself any more than I can separate being, a black person or the way that the world perceives me as a black person. So that is why a lot of autistic people these days do kind of lean more towards using that identity first language. So here are some languages that I encourage folks to keep in mind when you're working with disabled clients or disabled parents. A lot of times there are these euphemisms that people use because they think that for some reason it's better than just saying disabled. But it's not. Disabled isn't a bad word, and it can and should be used. And so some language that you might be familiar with as far as euphemisms go, you might have heard differently abled, special needs, handicapable or handicap, and special education. These are all pretty, um, you know, outdated terms, so you will still hear them. And again, are euphemisms. You can just say, this person is disabled or has a disability, and saying instead of saying special needs, you can name the specific need that that person has. Again, handicapable or handicap, just disabled or has a disability. And special education can be kind of a difficult one because it is still labeled that in actual school systems. But what we say in the disability community is that there's nothing special about having accessible education, and it really should be labeled accessible education because that's exactly what it is. And so, I encourage folks to use make these language changes when you're talking to a group of people or a specific client, and having like being a model for the rest of society to use this. So you may still hear people say, special needs, but when you are talking, speaking back to them, model the language that we're trying to encourage folks to use instead, naming the specific need. Or saying, if somebody says, oh, I was in special education as a kid or, whatever. Oh yeah, I also had accessible education, something of that nature. You don't want to correct folks, but if anything, you're planting kind of a little seed of what language could be used instead of what is traditionally used. These are some more words and phrases that really are important to remember, have this sort of um, like elicits this negative association with a lot of common disabilities. So things like, fall on deaf ears, turn a blind eye, paralyzed with fear, dumb it down, things like that. These are all terms that kind of come from a disability in some way, shape, or form, and should be avoid, using these terms in practice. Even things like, driving me insane. What are some things you can say instead? Well, instead of saying, this paperwork is driving me insane, this is overwhelming paperwork. This is a lot of paperwork. Fall on deaf ears. The folks that what I was speaking to, didn't really understand what I was saying, or they weren't interested in what I was saying. Turned a blind eye. I'm just gonna look the other way, easy as that. Some of these seem very, simple or silly even, but it really does make all the difference when you're speaking to somebody who has a disability, no matter what the context is. If you are, you don't know for sure if you're trying to make small talk and you come into a client's home and you say, "Oh my gosh, this weather's been so bipolar lately," when really you just mean it's been unpredictable. That person might have bipolar disorder. You never know. And so, these are some things that we try to, like keep in mind when we're talking to, our clients and things like that. This is where I gave that kind of disclosure about some of the language here. It's a yes or no chart. So on the right side of both charts, we're having words that we are trying to move away from, and then on the left side, yes, and on the right side, we're having words that we are trying to move more towards. So on the first chart, we have the handicapped. We talked about this already. Disabled person or person with a disability. The deaf or hearing impaired. Instead, we just want to say person who is deaf or hard of hearing. Instead of saying midget, we want to say little person or person with dwarfism is fine as well. High or low functioning. These are terms that you may particularly hear surrounding folks who are autistic or have a cognitive disability. There is a long history behind functioning labels that stems from World War II and eugenics, and the kind of label of who is, functioning or not functioning would be life or death for autistic people and people with cognitive disabilities during that time, quite literally life or death. And so instead, we are moving a little bit more towards higher low support needs, and this is still kind of iffy. This is still kind of like a new term that we're kind of, trying out to see how it works. As I said on a previous slide, I personally use a specific support need because low support needs or high support needs still kind of does the same thing as high or low functioning, where it may imply certain things, or you may get the certain idea that, whatever you think low support needs is might not be the same as what that disabled person thinks low support needs is. And I use myself as an example all the time because my support needs change so often. There are some times where I need my husband to bathe me or wash my hair for me, or if he doesn't cook for me, I won't eat. And those are, for me, relatively high support needs. But when it comes to working a 9 to 5 or teaching a class, I don't really have any support needs in regards to that. And so, this idea of disabilities being dynamic and changing is the reason why we try to move more towards either, saying these higher low support needs, or ultimately just switching it out for the whatever the specific support need is at that time. So if you're working with a parent who also has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and they are unable to get into certain positions on their own because of their joint instability, this is where, you would say, okay, this, for your notes, this client has mobility support needs or something of that nature. Um, Instead of saying insane, crazy, psycho, psychotic, this person has a mental health disability. This person, it is with a mental health disability. And the same goes for using these terms. Again, we just talked about some of these. We have like the word cloud with all the different phrases and everything. But even just avoiding saying these things in your everyday language instead of saying that, oh, last night was a crazy night at the hospital. Last night was overwhelming. Last night was a little little bit chaotic. Last night was, like we were unprepared, things like that. You really like tapping into that like English teacher thesaurus, kind of mindset and trying to find other synonyms for what you're really trying to say is that, it wasn't really crazy. It was overwhelming. It was chaotic. It was disorganized, those sorts of things. On the second chart, on our, no side, we have the blind. You can just say person who is blind or has low vision. On the spectrum, or a person with autism, you will still hear folks use on the spectrum, especially for people who are newly diagnosed, or people who are caretakers of autistic people, is what you'll typically hear. And this comes from this idea that somebody can be more or less autistic, when the spectrum isn't really like that. It's more like a pie chart, and each piece of the pie represents a different trait, a different autistic trait, for that person. And that pie might be bigger, that piece might be bigger or smaller depending on the day, the person they're talking to, the situation, the environment, all of those sorts of things. And so that's why we try to steer away from on the spectrum because it kind of implies that it is either you're on the high end or the low end, and that's not really how it works. So instead, you can just say autistic or neurodivergent. You may have heard that term. It is becoming more popular, and essentially just means any brain wiring that is divergent from what is considered to be typical. And so this is a umbrella term for a lot of different disabilities, including autism, but also ADHD, bipolar disorder, epilepsy, dementia, substance use disabilities. All of these things fall under neurodivergent because it is something that has changed the wiring of your brain. We talked about this confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound or bed bound. Instead, you can just say they're a wheelchair user or they are in a wheelchair. And hopefully, we don't use the term mentally retarded anymore. I think that the last time that I've heard it in like pop culture was probably in a song that may have come out in the past couple of years. But and this is actually outdated even still. So instead of saying intellectual disability, we actually want to move more towards cognitive disability. And the same with like, saying that somebody is a little slow. You may hear people self-identify as being slow, and that's fine. But you don't want to call them slow. You would instead just say, they have, maybe they need support with filling out paperwork, or they need support with, whatever it is that they need specific support with. Okay, a little bit of etiquette and considerations. This is something that across the board you always want to ask for consent. When doing things like adjusting someone's body, touching their baby, measuring nipples for flange size. Hopefully that goes without saying, but I always include it because you just never know. I think a lot of times healthcare professionals, regardless whether it's lactation or just a nurse who's taking your blood or whatever, kind of get into this flow state where they're just kind of doing things on autopilot and don't realize that this is an actual person who may or may not have trauma, may or may not be disabled, may or may not have, something that makes it, difficult for them to process touch in some sort of way. And so you always want to ask for consent. Um, Always assume competent. So even if a disability is disclosed, even if somebody says, I have a cognitive disability, or they have a caretaker who says, I have a cognitive disability, you want to assume that they are competent and that they do understand what you're saying, but to confirm that they understand. And consider offering things, and we talked about this down actually in a later bullet for accessibility, but this kind of goes with competence, just offering things in different formats. So if you have paperwork that you are asking the client to fill out, intake paperwork or anything like that, consider having multiple formats. So having something in large print, having something in Bionic font, which if you are able to see at the bottom of the page, is essentially making bold the first couple of letters out of a word. And that helps people who have ADHD or dyslexia kind of follow things a little bit easier. Or consider, offering things in Braille. Obviously some of these things might be costly or have, some sort of cost associated with them. But it is, worth it to account that in when you are talking about making sure that your practice is accessible to everyone. Some alternatives to Braille could be offering it in a PDF format that is screen reader accessible. After this session, I can absolutely send over to the team some resources to send out to you all that include, what exactly is large print font? What does it look like? What size is it? What is Bionic font? How do I do that? Is there a program for it? How do I make sure that something is screen reader accessible or that it has, the appropriate contrast, things like that. So I can send those resources out afterwards to go over and keep in your repertoire. And executive function as the last one, this is something that can impacts a lot of people with disabilities, but especially in that postpartum care. And if you don't know what executive dysfunction is, essentially is your brain's ability to just like do the thing, whatever the thing is, whether it's doing dishes, whether it's getting dressed, feeding yourself, bathing yourself, whatever it is, running errands, doing laundry. Your brain just can't do it, no matter how bad you want to, no matter how bad you need, you know that you need to, no matter how big the mess is. Your brain is just physically not able to let you do whatever the thing is, and this can really impact our postpartum community, especially those who have like little family support, especially if they're likely to have postpartum depression or co-occurring mental health disabilities that existed prior to getting pregnant and delivering. And so, when we are, especially if we're doing like health visits or anything like that, reserving the judgment about, the mess around. And I think a lot of times, we understand that like new parents are going to be behind on laundry, they're going to be behind on dishes, but people who are experiencing executive dysfunction, it might be more so than even you would expect for someone who it doesn't experience postpartum or executive dysfunction and postpartum. And it might be like borderline collector tendencies, which is a term that we are moving away from using the hoarder term and more towards collector. And it may appear to be that way. This is where I would encourage. There is a nonprofit organization that has several chapters across the US called Hot Mess Express. And they are an organization that helps parents with the mess in their house. The services are free. And so, what I would recommend is if you think that that might be helpful for clients, look up and see if there's a chapter near that parent. And don't necessarily say, oh, I noticed that your house is a mess. Here's this organization. But maybe in your care package, when you give them information about, how to make sure that their flange size is correct, how often they should be pumping, things like that, also include a little pamphlet for any local nonprofits that help with that sort of mess aspect of postpartum, would be my suggestion for that. All right, so it's a lot of information. We'll do a summary and then I'll open up for questions. But in summary, this competent care is especially hard to find in the disability community. But if you are able to, take what I've said here and the resources that I'll be sending, and kind of implement it into your practice, it makes it a lot easier for those of us who are disabled to access that care. It's accessibility is way more than just, ramps and automatic doors. It really is about the attitude that you have, whatever sort of, ideals that you're holding about disabled people. Take some time to look for organizations in your area that are ran by and for disabled folks and see if you can sit in on one of their gatherings or their meetings and just learn about the disabled community around you specifically, so that you can know how best to care for them. I also have told folks, consider doing a listening session if you're a lactation consultant or IBCLC prominent in your area, and you don't have any disabled clients or you don't think you have any disabled clients, consider doing a listening session at a local public library, where you can, have disabled parents come in and say, what are lactation consultants missing as far as care for this disabled community? It's really easy to get caught up in the like, oh, everyone in the world or everyone in the US. But if you start small with your community, and then kind of, reach out to your network of, I know that lactation consultants all talk to each other, or a lot of us do. And, so reach out to them and suggest the same thing. And hopefully, little by little, we're able to kind of make this aspect of living, feeding your baby with your milk, to be more accessible for everyone. And that is my presentation. You can find me on social media or contact me at Please Call Me Kai, PLSCALLMEKY is where you can find me on just about all social media. So Instagram, Facebook. I'm not on Twitter, but I am on Blue Sky and LinkedIn as well. And then my two separate emails are sweetnectarlactation@gmail.com and hello at Please Call Me Kai. And please is actually spelled out this time. So PLEASE callmekai.com is how you can reach me. And I'll stop sharing now, for real this time, and open up for any questions that might have popped up. I saw a couple things come up in the chat. So I don't know if Amber Wilkins, if you want to monitor and see if we got questions in there for folks.
Yeah, there were just a couple of comments. One person did ask, why do we name them handicap parking spaces? And then they followed up with outdated still, I suppose.
Yeah, those things are so in law you will still see handicap a lot, handicap spaces. One of the things that we do in Boston is we actually call them on-street accessible parking instead of handicap spaces. And so in when I lived in Boston and worked for the city, in our office we had an on-street accessible parking program manager. And so that's what we called our program. So we didn't call it, if somebody wanted to I guess, put an application in for a spot to be either put in front of their driveway or in front of a business. We called it the on-street accessible parking program. So that's a great question. Those things are harder to change. Language is just harder to change in specific like, laws and legislation and things like that.
Thank you for
Any
your question, Melissa. We also have another question, excuse me, from Julie Potts. You can go ahead, Julie, and come off mute.
Hi, could you please talk a little bit more about the difference between person-centered language and identity-centered language? I mean, I saw kind of the gist of it in your or in the slide, but it's still a little confusing to me which is the most respectful, I guess. And part of this comes from, so I work in a hospital setting in
Oh,
as a nurse, and we're encouraged to use language like a person with diabetes rather than a diabetic, or a person with epilepsy versus an epileptic. Um, and so I think I'm not I'm I think I just need a little more explanation or a little more help understanding, please.
yeah, that's a great question and absolutely valid. And I will also say that even I sometimes confuse the two as like which is person first and which is identity first. So I'll just put that out there if folks are like, which is which. That is a common, kind of a flip as well. And so the general idea is that there are some disabilities that are that folks feel are very integral to who they are, that are just as much a part of their identity as their sexuality, as their racial background, as their religious, sort of, following things like that. And so in that case, folks would use identity first, which is the identity or the disability, autistic person, which is what I use because again, this is, I've always been autistic. I will always be autistic, and it is something that everything that I do it the way that I do it because I'm autistic. The way that I speak, the way that I, socialize, the way that I eat my food, like everything is because I'm autistic. And so that is the kind of idea behind using identity first. Using person first, however, is the idea behind that is that there are some disabled folks who are just, especially like if they acquire disability later in life or as a result of an accident or aging or something of that nature, or it's just not really something that is like affecting their day to day. They may use that sort of person first. So saying, I have a seizure disorder. This is something that I just acquired. I just recently, like when I say just, I mean like in April, I was just diagnosed with a seizure disorder where it didn't exist before. seizure. And so they're non-epileptic seizures, so I can't say that I'm an epileptic. But my daughter just was diagnosed with epilepsy. And again, she was just diagnosed. So we're still kind of figuring out, okay, is she epileptic or does she have epilepsy? Well, right now we use she has epilepsy because this is new to us. It's something that isn't really part of her identity at this point. But later on down the road, she might choose to call herself an epileptic because maybe it is something that she feels is an integral part of her identity. So the idea, and this is where the social model comes in, is essentially letting folks decide, yes, exactly that, letting them decide how they want to be identified and what resonates with them. I don't think I can confidently say I don't think that anybody will take offense to one or the other. And it is okay to use, so if you're saying, if you want to use, that person first is saying, oh, this person is a diabetic, but you hear them say, I have diabetes, then you can switch your language to mirror theirs. But we don't want to correct folks. It's really, up to them how they want to self-identify and how they want to be, be referred to as. So when I was working for the city, when I taught classes, I did upfront tell people I use identity first language to say that I am autistic. However, I also use person first language to say I'm a person with mental health disabilities. And so it really is dependent on the person, the disability, their comfort level, all that good stuff. So that was a great question, Melissa. Thank you. Oh, I see. I think your hand's back up.
Yeah, and I think Melissa has another follow-up, and then we'll
Okay.
go over to Amber.
Sounds good.
Hi, thanks. So when we're talking about I see a lot of the chest slash breastfeeding. Um, I guess for me, we talk about breast because it's an anatomy, right? Like every chest doesn't have a breast, which has specific anatomy that creates lactation. So how do we connect with the reality and also like respect people and how they like to, I guess identify.
Yeah, that's another great question. And after I go, maybe Amber might also have a little bit more context. So I know you are, though we may both be part of the community, this is, it's Amber's wheelhouse a little bit more. But I'll say from my experience, both personal and professional, I typically will use chest or human milk or body feeding, those sorts of terms when I'm talking about a collective of people. I personally still very heavily identify with and resonate with the breastfeeding term. Like I personally use breastfeeding when I talk about my own journey. The reason behind this language shift is that there are folks who are trans folks who have had top surgery, but can still use their chest to feed their baby human milk with things like a supplemental nursing system that is taped to their chest, to their, presumably if they still have a nipple, they may still be able to tape it there, and have their baby actually feed on their chest that has no breast tissue there. Similarly, I talked about one of the stories in my book where somebody used their finger in a supplemental nursing system and their baby, nursed on their finger for an entire year. And that would be more so like body feeding because you're using a different part of your body to feed your baby. And so that's kind of where these terms come from, where, it is true typically and a lot of times that folks who are using their milk to feed their babies or even donor milk to feed their babies do have breast tissue. It's not always the case. And even if you're not trans, but you have had, breast cancer and you had that breast tissue just completely removed and you had a double mastectomy or whatever the case is, you may still want to or choose to feed your baby on your chest using some supports, using some tools that can help you kind of do that. And so that's why we kind of are, not only is it, encompassing of folks who are part of the LGBTQIA community, but also folks who are part of the disability community if they are a cancer survivor, or if they, for whatever other reason, maybe feeding on their breast isn't possible or feeding on their chest isn't possible, so they have to use their finger, things like that. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to pass it to Amber because I know that not only does she have a question, but also may have some input for this question as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so interesting listening to Kai's and seeing how much overlap there is around the language that we're using, especially when we're first interacting with families. So, from a medical perspective, as a medical provider, you may use terms like, how do we reconcile the biological presence of breast? But depending on who you're talking to, that could immediately be a block for them connecting with you. If they have body dysmorphia, if they've come off hormone therapy in order to become pregnant and their breast tissue has begun to grow and they're, it's a choice that they're making, but they don't identify with breast. If that person was seeking support and was immediately seen as female or feminine with these feminized pronouns and words, even though from a medical standpoint, you could argue that is breast tissue, it is a trust and a connection that has now been broken. So that is why sometimes if it's not your lived experience, it can feel like splitting hairs. But when you're talking about providing accessible care, you're also needing to be trauma informed. So a lot of times, by the time disabled and queer folks are gestating or deciding to have their families, unless they were very, very lucky, they have trauma. They have misidentification. They have not feeling like a lot of spaces were accessible to them. So when they're in a vulnerable space of how do I help my newborn human milk feed, using breastfeeding without thinking can turn somebody off and kind of shut down that connection. So it sometimes feels like splitting hairs, but I really do think so much of this comes down to language, because it's just about making that initial connection, because then once you have conversations going, then you mirror what they are saying. So it's kind of about not making assumptions. But before we get to that, I also wanted to ask a question. So Kai, let's say we're supporting someone who is human milk feeding. Are there resources for, like, in my La Leche League training, I didn't get trained on different positions for someone who only had the ability to move one arm, or someone who couldn't like open their hips to put the baby down low. Like, are there resources for those of us who are working in lactation support that kind of specify more of these when we're helping people with different abilities? I guess I'm asking because this isn't what you're commonly going to find in your lactation support guide.
This is a great question. To my knowledge, there is not. However, this is a great time to drop that I am writing a part two to my book that does include, that will include illustrations of different positions and considerations and things like that. So it's been been working on it for over a year now. It's, we'll see when it comes out. But yes, to my knowledge, there is not one that exists. That being said, I did start a while ago a Facebook group for disabled lactation consultants. It's not super active, but it's something that I would love to grow. And in the idea behind that is having folks join it to kind of talk about, if they personally had been on a journey of, human milk feeding, or if they've just worked with a lot of disabled clients, sort of giving input and that sort of thing for these exact like specific types of questions. So if folks are interested in joining that, even if you're not like an actual lactation consultant, but just, maybe like a peer, like somebody who has also gone through a journey and would like to be like a peer mentor or something of that nature, I can send out the link with the other resources that I send to join that Facebook group. Like again, I said, it's not super active. There's only like a few people in it, but I'm hoping that over time it grows and things like that. So that's a great question, and great opportunity for me to drop writing a second book. So thanks, Amber.
All right, Amber, are you ready for me to start sharing?
Yes.
Okay. You guys let me know when you can see my screen.
Okay, I can see it. So I am here representing the lived experience of being a queer parent who gestated and human milk fed my baby. I'm going to talk a lot about my lived experience here, but for a bit of context, I became a Lactate League leader that first year of pandemic. And then I did a lot of queer lactation advocacy through Breastfeed Durham for several years. And in the last year, I stepped down from my lead role with the Queer Coalition with Breastfeed Durham to start my own nonprofit about accessibility and queer and neurodivergent accessibility in education. So I'm still definitely in the advocacy space, and I'm still an active Lactate League leader. So I'm still a peer-to-peer lactation support. But my pie of advocacy is kind of growing. So my daughter is almost 8. So this would have been in November 2017. And my wife and I waited until our mid-30s, and I chose to carry. And we were outside of DC in Virginia, and we were very lucky to work with a midwife. Looking back, they definitely could have been more queer supportive. It's really interesting to think that that was only 8 years ago, but being in the queer advocacy that I am today, looking back, I'm like, ooh, I wonder if I can contact them. And invite some of these conversations, just because when you are experiencing these new things like being pregnant, and we only have chosen family, right, for direct reasons of being queer in the South. So we kind of, I think, sometimes forget how recent and local safety is, and being seen as a whole person and being queer. So my wife and I both come from Southern religious families, and we're not accepted by those families. And I think sometimes people get surprised by that because they're like, wait, it's 2025. But we still live in the South, guys. There's still a lot of religion around. And so when you're in this vulnerable space and you're seeking care, I quickly realized my lived experience was very polarized. I either felt seen and understood by the language and the way people talk to me and my wife, and then my newborn baby, or who didn't, who made assumptions, asked where the dad was. If I went to an appointment by myself, like, oh, is dad not here? Like those simple things that, kind of like Kai was talking about with the language around disability, we're so used to saying it. And I think especially in a feminine presenting space, lactation is very often feminine presenting. Gestating a baby is often very feminine presenting, that it's just so easy for us, if we don't think about it, to refer to someone as, oh, how's mama doing today, right? Instead of asking, what would you like your child to call you? You know, simple things like that. So my pregnancy, I worked really hard to stay out of the hospital, because that was my whole, not my whole reason. But when I decided to gestate, I wanted to chest feed, and I knew that the more interventions during a birth, the harder that could be. So I worked really hard for an out of hospital birth, which included an external cephalic version, so where they turn your breech baby upside down. And then she was almost 2 weeks past due date. So if you have worked with midwives, you know that if you hit that 14 days post due date, they like liability wise can't let you be at the birthing center. So we barely made it. And so she was born unmedicated birth. My milk came in incredibly fast, like maybe within 12 hours. That ended up being an oversupply issue for almost a year. So La Leche League was the first place I called day 5. I had ended up going to a La Leche League meeting when I was pregnant because that was recommended. And I'm so glad I did, because you get a face. I'm also newly diagnosed autistic, and now I realize that I could have never made that call if I hadn't seen a face, because calls are the worst thing ever. So kind of understanding that as well, when you are supporting people, they might not even know their accessibility needs and their why they can't make that call. And so the more welcoming and opening we can be, and the more understanding, the quicker that connection is going to be. So from day 5 all the way until we weaned at almost 6 years, La Leche League and peer-to-peer support was my lifeline. So next slide. So also, many of us who have had trauma for various reasons, we have a child, and that child shakes everything up, whether it's hormonal, whether it's the act of being a parent. I had a very high needs, pretty nonstop baby, so I wasn't sleeping much. And that ended up being a mental health crisis at about 3 months postpartum. And the ER visit and the immediate support at the hospital was atrocious. Very unsupportive, very anti-breastfeeding, very, if we're going to give you any pharmaceutical help, you have to wean right this second. That kind of got me started on my mental health advocacy in how it relates to being a lactating parent. My midwives, and again, this is when I talk about how important community care is. My midwives knew how committed I was to lactation, and they went out of their way and helped find me a psychiatrist that specialized in maternal mental health. So someone who really knew the ins and outs of pharmaceutical mental health and how to work with pregnant and chest feeding parents. And that really turned the boat for me, of feeling heard, feeling seen, and feeling like I could have mental health support and be respected as a lactating queer parent all at once. But I truly believe that we cannot talk about the effort and the work and the experience of human milk feeding without talking about mental health support, because even if you don't have a mental health crisis, 100% human milk feeding one child or twins or triplets, it's a lot, and it takes a lot of support. And I think best case scenario, you're still going to need mental health support. Like, I think best case scenario, we need to honor the work of 24/7 lactation support. And yes, I do continue to get support with postpartum mental health. And I realized that in the beginning, I thought postpartum meant only like a few months. And now 8 years postpartum, I'm starting to realize, no, it's a marker, right? It's before I gestated and it's after I gestated. And what does that look like? Next slide, please. Okay, and so this is where Kai and I overlap a lot. So we recently, just in the last year, finally got some diagnosis for our child. So we finally got an autism diagnosis, we got dyslexia diagnosis, and we have a much broader team of support now. All of these pictures, she's about 2.5 to 3.5. And this is when I started to see that my lived experience as a parent was not mirrored in my peers. So we can kind of get in this bubble where this is what I'm experiencing. Everyone's got to be working this hard, right? Everybody's got to have 1 hour sleep windows. Everybody has to have a toddler during the pandemic who nurses literally a dozen or more times during the day. Like that's everybody, right? And so becoming a Latte League leader and supporting more parents was really healing for me to see, oh, I'm not making this up. This really is intense. And then when she was 3, we finally started OT when she went through a couldn't wear clothes time period, and she was naked all the time. And a dear friend who's actually on this call said, hey, you might want to Google some stuff. You might want to Google the term sensory processing. And it was great. It was a great way to be introduced. Like, you never want to be told what to do, but it was a great thing to know what to Google, because it was second year of pandemic. I think probably when Kai was writing their book, you're just so overwhelmed. And we have an only child. We still have an only child. So when you have an only and it's a pandemic and they're 3 and they're not able to tolerate clothing, you kind of really start figuring it out. So through this has also led me to more advocacy, queer advocacy and disability advocacy. Next slide, please. This slide's a little old. Oh, but it is. We did wean at almost 6. So as a peer-to-peer lactation support person, we get a lot of parents who are nearing the 1-year mark. And I get reminded that culturally, a lot of us are given a narrative that human milk is really only needed until they're 1. Even though the World Health Organization has updated that to recommend human milk to be offered until at least 2. So even though there is research backing the benefit of human milk for at least 2 years, I think that there are plenty of subcultures here in America, Southern BIPOC families that I work a lot with, but then just Southern families in general, I find, they're really worried that if I nurse past 1, I'm going to be judged. So that's been a learning journey. Again, how to be culturally competent and respectful while giving information and respecting each lived experience and their goals. So I tend to ask what that individual person's goal is. And if they have a goal, but they're feeling guilty because it's different from what their family expects, then we can talk about that disconnect instead of saying, you should nurse until 2, right? Because that's not our job. It's our job to listen and give information and help someone reach that goal if they want to go past 1, or maybe they don't even know it's possible. I remember when she was getting really big at 4 and the pandemic, that was kind of lessening and you could go back to the museums and playgrounds. She was really big for her age too. And I remember getting a lot of visual judgment from people in public. So again, my peer-to-peer support circles were the ones who were like, take her shoes off. Kids always look bigger with shoes. Take her shoes off and let her curl up. She'll look smaller, right? Because it wasn't that I wanted to stop. It was that I felt judged. And so when I do these talks to groups and I'm representing a queer lived experience, a lot of us are coming with trauma and we're not wanting to fit in. We're just wanting to be seen. We're just wanting to exist, and we're wanting to be acknowledged. So in these conversations with providers, to be acknowledged that we may be human milk feeding for many years, or we may just have 6 months as our goal. We may identify our chest, or we may use breast, and we want to mirror what we're using. We don't want to assume there's a dad in the picture or even a partner, right? You may, someone's co-parent may be maybe a different family member. They may be in a polycule, so there's more than one other caregiver. We just want to be really curious and stay in curiosity and out of judgment until we hear what the person we're working with and the person we're helping, what terms they're using. And sometimes maybe they haven't thought about it. If they're pregnant or just given birth, you may be the first person to ask, what would you like your child to call you, right? As a way of saying, instead of saying, do you want to be called mom or dad? Like, there's a lot of different words that people choose, especially in the trans and non-binary realm, that is outside a gender binary. So instead of us giving an either or, having more curiosity. Oh, and I see, yes, Kai, too, that a lot of people are single by choice parents. My daughter was just asking about that. And it's sweet. You can tell how vocal we are. She was like, well, how does one person do it, Mama? Because I talk a lot about how I cannot do what I do by myself. And I tell her, like, hopefully they have a lot of good friends, because we know that raising children is a community. So I want to leave room for questions. That's my lived experience and kind of what I bring to the advocacy space is just a lot of what Kai was saying, but on the LGBTQ side of really giving space for people to trust that you're listening. And it's okay to make mistakes, but it's also okay to go slow. It's okay to start with just very open-ended, vague language that specifically asks the person you're working with, what language would you like me to use for this potty part, for this process? And take notes so that the next time you see them, you're not having to start over. But yeah, I do want to leave 10 minutes for questions.
Hi, Amber. My question is related to your weaning process for your little one. Was that kind of initiated by your little one, or was that initiated by you? How was that?
Yeah. So now that I can confirm my suspicion was right and she's autistic, she did co-regulation through lactation. So
Right.
that was kind of why I had a 5-year-old who was still nursing all the time. And I have an almost 8-year-old who still needs to cuddle and kiss the breasts a lot. It was, I always say it was 90% child-led in that she just got big enough. And I think I know how sensitive she is now to sticking out and she's easily embarrassed. I think she
Mm.
social wise
Mm.
kind of stopped herself, except for the nighttime in the morning.
Mm.
And that last 10%, like I could sometimes skip the nighttime, but the morning snuggle nurse was the last one to go. And that's that 10% that I said was parent led. So that was she was almost 6 and I started putting a t-shirt on and I started to say no. And that sounds interesting to people who have a completely different weaning story, much younger. But she was very vocal and we had talked for a couple years about weaning, just kind of letting her know that it was going to come. And so the last 10% was no. And she definitely has meltdowns in general around things that don't go her way. So that was a hard time. And she still talks about nursing. She just last night said, your breath smells so good, Mama. So That's just and I think it's also because we have an only. I think it's a little different maybe when you have multiple kids or I don't know, my lived experience of having we homeschool too. So just like having a very close knit only, and the pandemic hit and she was two, like it just kind of, nursing helped me survive the pandemic years. So it was 90% led by her, and that last 10% was me putting on a t-shirt.
Thank you for sharing.
Love or Kai, I don't remember who had their hand up first.
Amber, I wanted to say how brave you are for sharing your story and how emotional it even is for me. And I feel like at that last part, you started almost to turn the volume down on how brave it is and how many other parents there are who don't have the privilege to homeschool their kids, who are in public school, who are navigating extent, who have kids with a lot of needs, and they're working so hard to meet those needs, and they're hiding their lactation journey, they're struggling with their weaning journey at home and have all these things going on that they're not feeling safe talking to their care providers about what's going on. And really, by not being able to have those safe, not feeling safe to have those conversations, their kids are missing out on some really great diagnoses. And I think y'all know, Amber and I have talked a lot about how so much of this stuff presented from the very beginning at Little Bitties. You could see some of these things coming on. And those of us in a lactation, especially those of us who have the privilege to do peer-to-peer support, like we see some of the complexities, and the more we can know about how these things connect to development, the better job we can do of educating parents so that they can find the resources they need. And just, I want to say, like, just, I want to say again, thank you for sharing your story, and everybody know, like, Amber's so brave to say it out loud, and there's so many families who are not.
And that's why I'm so passionate about continuing to do talks like this to fellow providers is like, I found a pediatrician I could tell the truth to, but I lied to my dentist. So you kind of and it never feels good as a parent. Like it never feels good to lie. But you kind of know who is not going to judge you and who is 100% going to judge you. And so I think that's why I feel really passionate about this work, because the more care providers can understand the burden of parenting sometimes, especially when you're needing extra support. I wish parents didn't have to question, can I tell my pediatrician the truth? So thank you. Yeah. But that's also why I kind of self-identify myself as a loudmouth. Like that's why I'm not quiet about this kind of stuff, because if I'm not just out there saying it, who's going to say it? And if I don't say it, then no one else who's maybe not as bold, they're going to feel safer if they just hear somebody else say, yeah, they didn't wait until 6 and they lied to the dentist.
Melissa, I see you have your hand raised, unless Kai, you have something to add.
Yes, just a quick also thank you. Especially if we're talking about that extended journey, as people call it, of feeding. When I had Aubrey, our journey ended way, way before I wanted it to. And I tried even for years after I stopped pumping to get her interested again in latching. And then even when I had the twins, and she would get so close to me and she was so interested in it. And I'm like, do you want to try, like at 5 years old, I was like, do you want to try, you used to do it all the time as a baby. And she's like, no, I'm okay. Like every day I'm like, "Ugh, just one last time, please." And my family is like, that's so weird. Like she's 6 years old now and she has teeth and she's in school and she hasn't nursed forever. And I'm like, you don't understand. Like I didn't want it to end, and it ended before I was ready. And even, with the twins too, like they weaned from latching much earlier, and I continued on pumping because I went back to work. As with Aubrey, I was stay at home. But even still with the twins, I still try to get them to latch again because I'm like, just one last time would be great. And I do think it's really, really important for people to talk about that, like, extended journey of nursing, because just like you said, there's so much shame around it. And I felt a lot of like comfort in hearing that that your babies still want to, touch and kiss and everything. Because even though my oldest has stopped nursing, she still is very much like constantly like kissing my breasts and and grabbing them and everything. And I'm like, people have this weird, like, they sexualize it, and it's not that. It's just like this was the way that we connected after we were physically connected, with you in my womb. And I think people just don't understand that aspect of it. And so hearing that there are people who love to and want to continue past the first year or two is amazing. So just echoing also what Love said, and thank you. I'll pass it to Melissa because it probably has an actual question, but thank you.
You're muted, Melissa.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, this question is actually for all of our facilitators, because this training specifically helps all of us kind of empathize with others and be able to be better service providers for all folks. Um, would you find it, or do you think it would also be valuable to teach or facilitate resilience training for folks who do feel sensitive to those judgments? Creating internal landscape where we don't have to lie to our dentist, but still feel strong in our own being and our own soul's choice for however we want to, provide for ourselves and our family. Do you think that's equally valuable? Um, yeah, just
The only
curious.
question I have with that, that I want to be really sensitive to, and I talk a lot about this with my fellow Black peer-to-peer lactation people, is that it's one thing for a crunchy mama to bring their kid without shoes to a playground, but then if you're a Black mama that brings their kid without shoes, you could get CPS called on you. But if you're white, you're just that crunchy mama. So I think we need to be careful about talking about it like it's all inside this one individual when we live in a systemically racist and judgmental space. And as a queer cisgendered woman right now in North Carolina, I don't feel particularly safe with what's happening politically, even on a local basis. And I think I'm not discounting internal resilience, but we need to balance that with the reality of the town you live in and the neighbors
Mhm.
you have and the politics going on,
Mhm.
and the real safety concerns that
Mhm.
some of us have.
Okay. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo that as well. And just saying that I think that it is helpful. And as Amber was talking about how just society is going to view different parents different way based on their race and ethnicity regardless. Is letting those of us who are going to be judged the harshest lead the education and lead the because we have the lived experience of you know I have a friend who had braided her child's hair and got CPS called for braiding her child's hair because some white mom at the playground said that it was child abuse because she had only ever seen people crying and screaming, or like things like that. That is obviously ridiculous to those of us who understand that that's ridiculous, but is a very real reality for a lot of Black and brown folks. And letting us be the ones to lead that education through our lens is what is going to help to combat that just inevitable racism that's going to happen, that inevitable classism, that sort of thing, because we are giving the information from our lived experience from a lens that is trauma informed because it's the trauma that we lived, and that we continue to live every day. So I do think that it would be beneficial. I agree with what Amber is saying that it definitely, there needs to be an awareness of the political climate. And I will say, having moved from Boston down to Charlotte, I am struggling, y'all, down here for sure. Because
You need
despite
to try. We're moving.
yeah,
We're moving the
listen,
needle.
I'm here. I said if I'm gonna live down here, like I'm gonna have to start making some changes because like things need to move a different direction. And like there is still a queer community here. There is still a disabled community here. We're here, in North Carolina, but it is, again, not at all like it was in Boston. And there's not even part of it is that there's not even the resources down here for it to be like it is in Boston. So that's where, that education piece I think is critical. So I think that's a great question. And I would definitely encourage, another thing to think about is like letting Black and brown folks who have already signed up to do that, and not asking somebody new to be like, hey, can you use your emotional and mental, energy to create this thing that I have an idea for, but I need a Black face on it. Like, I'm someone who's already doing the work. Why would somebody else go to my sister who has zero interest in doing that? Things like that. And I would also say, look and see, there might already be something around, that is led by Black and brown folks. So yeah, I think that's a great question.
Thank you for your response. It's enlightening. I always make the analogies with nature, and I think of, you know, I kind of like assimilate each individual as a tree, and the winds of nature are what build a tree up strong. And what I'm hearing you say is some winds are tropical storms that make us unsafe and unstable, and we lose our root system. So that's how I'm interpreting that and how I receive that, and I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Love, did you have some closing messages you wanted to provide? And then I'll finish up after you.
I wanted to say thank you all for joining us. This is our last funded series, part of the First Food Equity series, inspired by the Durham County Department of Public Health and the Durham County Commissioners, and with the support of implementing the 10 steps to a breastfeeding family-friendly community through an audience segmentation lens, where we think about, do we get everybody? And I loved that we got to have this conversation, and thank you all for joining us. It's been an incredible journey.
All righty. I want to say thank you again to Amber and Kai for finishing off this amazing series so strongly. Thank you to all the participants for your engagement in today's topic. We really appreciate when you all ask questions, when you talk in the chat, when you provide your own stories. In order to receive your certificate of completion, you guys will get an email link tomorrow morning from Piedmont AHEC. And there you will have the link to your evaluation. Once you complete your evaluation, you'll have access to your certificate of completion. If you all enjoyed this program and would like to see more programs with Amber, Kai, Breastfeed Durham, please include that in your evaluations. We do take your comments seriously in order to plan next year's programs, and also hopefully to get some additional funding to continue to put on programs like this. I hope you guys have a great rest of your terrific Tuesday. Stay dry, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.